Of course, everyone of you knows Stettin probably much better than I do. So a couple of words before I really start. Actually the topic of looking into Szczecin as a border town comes from an idea Professor Wojciech Stępiński suggested to me a really long time ago, long before I was thinking coming to Szczecin, to university. And actually, I then looked a little bit into it and prepared a short text for the German-Polish textbook commission, history textbook commission, and then from time to time return to this topic. And actually, what I'm going now to present is based on a collective volume I'm preparing with colleagues from Finland and Denmark, where we look into towns or cities with manifold memories. So it's more about memory studies, but of course, so it's focusing on towns which are somehow shaped by borders, so territorial borders. And then the question is, what is the impact also on other kinds of boundaries? So this is why I'm talking to you about Szczecin today. And let's try to start my presentation, which somehow has disappeared here. Recording has started, but yeah, okay, but I think you should see it. So actually, I keep the first slide for a while before then sharing is paused. Why is sharing paused? Okay, so let's not look at these technical issues only when they are relevant for us. So actually, I have two short episodes as an introduction. The first is, so some 15, 20 years ago, there was a frequently visited pub in the old town of Riga in Latvia, which had the name of the Eastern Border. And the question why such a pub was named Eastern Border, because in Riga there is, so the Eastern Border of Latvia is somewhere else. And obviously, so this was not about the border in a territorial sense, but in a temporal sense. So behind the Eastern Border was what Latvian society has left behind. So communism, Soviet Union, Soviet culture, and so on. And all these relics were then placed as an interior design in this pub. So the question, why doing it? Obviously, so the horror of the former system has already disappeared, so and has turned into some kind of popular culture, if not nostalgia. So meaning when talking about borders, so this temporal aspect is quite important. And actually, so the idea to look into these temporal borders has been, at least for the German discussion, suggested by the historian Karl Schwögl already, also some 15 years ago, I would say. But let's come with a second episode to Szczecin. A couple of years ago, so I was on my way from the train station to the radio studio, in this nice high-rise building for recording a broadcast on a discussion on German-Polish relations, which at this time so was this discussion about how to remember expulsion of the Germans, so to build a new museum and so on. And so the taxi driver asked me what I'm going to do, and I told him, and I said, it would have been better if Szczecin had remained a German town, so not turned into a Polish one. And then I was asking him, say, but if Szczecin had stayed German in 1945, so it would have been part of the GDR and then of the unified Germany and without Poles. And then he said, no, it is not such a problem. So the Poles would have immigrated into the city anyway. So, so what does this mean? So for the taxi driver, obviously the territorial border was not relevant. So that Szczecin is a Polish city and no longer a German one, so this didn't play a role for him. So for him, it was rather an economic border. So meaning, so he wanted to be on the better side of Europe and living in a surrounding which is economically better off. And so why I'm telling this, so meaning that obviously also among the city society, so the idea that Szczecin is a Polish city and must be only a Polish city, which shaped, let's say, the discussion after Second World War, somehow has disappeared. So this as an introduction, why looking at these various borders? So this means we have to look why or which relevance did the territorial border of Szczecin have and how did it shape? And then the first question would be, and so I'm now trying to move on, so nothing is going. Okay, so if we talk about Szczecin as a border city, so then of course we should start in 1945, but we could also ask whether there have been early ideas that somewhere the Szczecin is on a border, so in a territorial sense. And then the question, do you see now something new on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, this is fine. So, and then we could go back to the mid-19th century. So probably you know this. So an article written by Friedrich Engels for the New York Daily Tribune. So the background is the Crimean War. So the question, so the war between, let's say, United Kingdom and not only and Tsarist Russia, and there Engels comes up with the idea so that maybe in the natural frontier of Russia might be seen from okay, this did not work. Okay, might be seen between, so starting from Danzig or perhaps Szczecin to Trieste. So meaning that Szczecin, some within, so Russophiles might see Szczecin as, or Stettin as the border town of the Tsarist Empire. So the question is why? Then, of course, based on early Slavic history and the Tsar as a person who should take care of all of them, then would include these territories. So meaning long before the Iron Curtain started, so the idea that the western border of the Russian Empire might start in Szczecin was already existing. And we could also look into Polish discussion, so you definitely know this. So the idea by Zygmunt Wojciechowski launched first in the 1930s, then continued after the war, so that the Ziemie Macierzyste Polskie, so the Polish motherlands, that they should include Pomerania as a Prussian province, so today's Pomorze Zachodnie, and then we see also Szczecin as a part, so on the western border of Poland. So meaning these ideas existed before they came into being. Then, of course, the next issue is how the border was installed. And you probably also know this. So this was not yet fully done at the conference of Potsdam, but only then set up afterwards. But what we see before is that Stalin was talking to the Polish communists and already offering them during the war the case or the situation that the eastern parts of Poland would stay under Russian control, and so meaning that then there should be some recompensation, and this was done definitely clearly in a meeting in Moscow in January 1944. And then, let's say, set into place after the war ended. And only after the Potsdam Conference, the agreement was made that the border then has more or less the shape than it has today, when city president Zaremba went to Schwerin to sign such a document, which also implied that until October 1945, so the western city limits of Szczecin were also the state borders of Poland, which definitely impacted the first months of the city. What also happened as a result of this new border was that the German population totally had to leave Szczecin, and actually, so, and you know the steps, of course. So let's say the first fleeing of the German population, then some kind of these more or less spontaneous evictions, and then the organized resettlement starting then in late 1945 and lasting, I think, until 1948, when the last German inhabitants had left the city. So, and why is this relevant? Because Szczecin is different from Gdańsk or Wrocław, as we do not have such, let's say, population in between. So some local minorities as Kashups or people who could claim that they are Orthodox and should stay in the place where they're living. So we don't have this in Szczecin, meaning that this was a really harsh, so the shift of the border, also a harsh cut in the city history. What then happened is that was no longer Germans being in the city, so that the remembering of Szczecin, and now I'm turning to, let's say, mnemonic discourses. So the remembering of Szczecin followed rather clear list of subjects, starting with the Christianization of Pomerania by Otto von Bamberg, then having you see it, the dukes as vassals of the German emperor, and so on, German town law, Reformation, and then actually with a jump into history, forgetting the Swedish period, and then starting with the rule of the Hohenzollern dynasty since 1713. And actually ending with the resettlement, expulsion of the Germans, and then only having in mind, partly also politically, that there must be or should be some restitutio ad integrum, so the return of Stettin to Germany, and then once again becoming a German city, which implied ignoring everything which happened after 1945. So this, of course, is a very rough picture, but I would say definitely until the early 1960s, this shaped the West German picture, and only after the treaty with Warsaw in 1970, very slowly started to change. When I'm talking about German, this means mainly West German, because, let's say, public commemoration of Stettin as a Prussian city in GDR did not exist. So the only thing were family memories, and they often followed the same pattern, let's say, of a German national remembrance of the city. So in contrast, the Polish mnemonic narratives, so it's very much shaped on what we see here. So this article by Czesław Piskorski, Byliśmy, jesteśmy, będziemy. So meaning that history plays a role in the city, but rather limited. So, and then we see different elements, so being part of the territory of Mieszko. So this, not talking about this, whether this is, let's say, historically correct or not, so the truth, but rather how it was depicted, so meaning that Szczecin was Polish even before it became German. Then looking at the Greifen dynasty, so rather the connections to the Polish ruling dynasties and not only to the German or not to the German emperor. Attempts to free the city from the Swedish rule, and then also with a big gap jumping into the period after 1945, so making the city a Polish one, forgetting the Prussian period. And then this, the last point is an argument that Eric Krasuski and others have made, that actually, so the uprisings, so the stock of the shipyard workers actually created a new Polish identity of Szczecin, which mixed many things. So some kind of a socialist consciousness or socialist identity, but also connecting the national Polish view and making something new out of this, and then overcoming this, what often has been described as this period of uncertainty, so that people were not really clear whether Szczecin would remain a Polish city forever, or might be with some deal with the Soviet Union then restored to the GDR. So if we have then this clear memories, so we should also say, just the pictures to explain, so the uprising of 1970, and then what we then might see in this monument on the Chin Polaków, so that's somehow memorizing this Polish taking over of Szczecin. However, so what comes clear of what I've said before is that actually the German memory of Szczecin was something from the distance, so not really connected to what was going on in the city. And even if there were reports how Szczecin looked like after the war, so this actually did not really affect the perception, let's say, of the majority of old Stettiner. Although this is difficult to say, because usually we would look at the let's say, publications by the ex-police organizations, so the Landsmannschaft, but it was also clear that the Landsmannschaft definitely, although they claimed to represent all people who left Pomerania, that definitely many people in Western Germany already from the beginning did not identify themselves with the political actions by the Landsmannschaft, so rather staying apart. But so if we have something in public, so it definitely was only connected to the period until 1945, and everything what happened afterwards did not really play a role. So this meaning that there was a clear temporal border in the perception of Szczecin. A similar thing happened on the Polish side. And now it's not only, let's say, about publications, but it's also about urban development. So the urban shape of the city, and their famous thing is, which you definitely know, so the idea of Piotr Zaremba to reorient Szczecin from its artificial connection, as he wrote, to Berlin, to its natural Polish hinterland, so the territories across the Oder. And this then also identified his ideas how so natural hinterland to Poland, but also to the north, to the seashore, and then cutting off. So this is the small arrow you see in lower left corner, which would provide the Berlin, which definitely was dominating before. So this should then be ignored and play no longer role. And as you know, how this then shaped the city center of Szczecin was that the old town, which was partly destroyed, was then totally ignored, with the exception of the castle, and a new road then implemented, which then should also symbolize the new connection. So to the north, so to the then seashore, and across the narrow bridge, then to the eastern banks of the Oder River. So this was, let's say, how this new identity of Szczecin materialized in urban development. And yeah, we could also, you then see it that, let's say, the city center then totally disappeared and something else happened. First being empty, and then was, let's say, some of, then connected to, surrounded by these infrastructure, so the streets, so the Trasa Zamkowa, actually finished only after 89, but nevertheless, so symbolizing these plans of the Rembe. And if you look at the Podzamcze, so the old town, directly, so we clearly see that the old buildings were erased, and then we have these nice hotel, which actually now was replaced by a new hotel. But nevertheless, so you clearly see there was a totally different approach towards the heritage, the historical structure of the city, and meaning that urbanist development definitely had and was based on judgments on history and of ways how to remember or what to remember from the history of Szczecin. Doing briefly, then we clearly see that there was a turn in the 1990s, which brought Podzamcze back. And then the question is whether to call it a mnemonic turn. This might seem a little bit odd. Because what does it mean? So it would mean that, let's say, people deciding about the shape of the former old town had some memory of the old town, which before the war, which definitely is not the case, or if there were people, so it were only very few. But this is what then could be called a prosthetic memory. So meaning that the memory is somehow prolonged into the past by the means of media. So when this by Alice Lanzo was launched, this idea of a prosthetic memory, she was rather thinking about, let's say, cinema and so on. But my argument is that you could also use architecture and urban structures. It's something being prosthetic and prolonging the memory. So this is also what you know. So let's say, of course, it was not a one-to-one reconstruction, but reconstruction following so the Elblong model, partly making use of the structures that are in the ground and adapting the volume of the buildings and to what more or less has been there before. Yeah, so actually what we then see is some kind of a hybrid solution, definitely, because so these new blocks rather or partly resemble the post-war reconstruction or rebuilding of the old town. So and not fully what has been before the war. And as we see, it was a long process, having still in the early 2000s the Arcona hotel still in place before it was then only afterwards dismantled. Further things which underline also the idea that there's something hybrid is happening, is what happened to the Corleone monument, which actually was never has been on a public space, but was part of the museum collections. But then let's say, with the attempts by city initiative to get it back, so then the idea was to display it publicly, and not only by accident, but also by somehow taking the attention away from this nice monument of their gratitude towards the Red Army, which of course also is now history, but where we clearly see, let's say, that there was also some kind of a symbolic boundary introduced between this Soviet or post-Soviet space and then this new old space of the city, as some of the new city, which is somehow collected to the traditions and relics and monuments from the past. Of course, we could go there much further, and I have many slides on this, but let's do it very briefly. So you could also do the Cascada, somehow related not only to the post-war history, but also pre-war history. Although this is definitely a rather loose illusion what has been there before. What we also see then, and then I would briefly look into publications. So some bridging the, let's say, gap of 1945. So, but as we see, definitely this is something which mainly happened on the Polish side and not so much on the German side, although this publication of documents on Szczecin 1945-46 was a German-Polish, rather triadic, so West German, East German, Polish undertaking, but nevertheless it was dominated by the impact of Polish historians from Szczecin, whereas the West German participants from the Landsmannschaft and then East German from the University of Greifswald were rather fighting in between about the right way of commemorating, so German Stettin, or the period, let's say, in between. The same holds for what you see in the center, some publication done by the Kulturforum in Potsdam, also very much based on contributions from Polish authors. So clearly showing that the approach, or let's say the bridging of the two cities, so the historical one and the post-war one, was rather in the interest of today's inhabitants of today's society, and not so much and by the previous inhabitants, some of them, of course, interested, but not giving the impulse to do something new. All right, so I skip these things, and then maybe come to the last point, showing that this is not only a thing which is somehow in harmony, so that everyone agrees that, let's say, there should be a connection between the old German town and the new Polish one, and maybe doing something new. But we also see clearly mnemonic conflicts, and this is actually, I think, what you definitely know and have analyzed. So about this Zedina monument, which disappeared as the other monuments during the war. So the space is, as you know, it's today. So so the fundament is there, but the rest is missing, and then it's just replaced by this anchor. And as you know, there have been some 10 years ago these ideas of replacing or restoring Zedina and making these nice plaster copy of Sedina, which I think was shown in the National Museum. What's the background? So the background is not rather, let's say, only a glorification of the German past, or let's say maybe as some of the German former inhabitants would have seen it, but rather using the German past for changing Szczecin in the present. So meaning so that this rather Wilhelminian nationalist monument turned into a symbol of the flourishing city, economically flourishing city at the end of the 19th century, meaning so remembering the better days of the town. So this was actually not, as I understand it, not to talk about a German-Polish reconciliation or somehow integrating the German history, but rather looking for symbols that are showing that the period before socialism. So I think it's more this issue. And as we know, nothing. So these ideas have somehow disappeared and not being realized. But of course, we could add more things to this discussion. But if we have another conflict, maybe one should not call it conflict, but some kind of a void space of memory. And I would say as well as in the German mnemonic discourses as in the Polish mnemonic discourses. And this is a German Jewish history. So actually, there has not been much done within the framework of the expellee organizations talking about German Jewish Stettiner. So this was left to those who survived the Holocaust. And only in the 1990s, a very slow debate has started, but already hardly integrating those who have lived in Szczecin and survived the Holocaust. And so now what we see is, so on the one hand, we have this definitely abandoned space of the former synagogue with some kind of bricks which have nothing to do with the synagogue, I would say. But now at least somehow alluding to the place, so the mural which was, I think, opened a couple of weeks ago on this space. But definitely it shows also distance to approaching Jewish history, because I would say it's rather a romantic depiction of the situation. So which does not fully reflect the destruction of the Jewish community in 1938 and the deportation in 1940, which of course was done by the German Nazis. But if one would, this would be my argument, somehow integrate German Jewish history into the some kind of a general history of Szczecin, also this brutal end should be reflected. So maybe this mural is one step for further discussion, but it's definitely not the end. There have, and one might add this also, there have also been these discussions whether these German idea of stumbling blocks would be appropriate for Stettin, but so there have been two initiatives which actually have not met very much support in the city council and definitely then passed away during the pandemic. But so this, of course, is maybe not the end of the discussion. So then if we talk about these hybrid ideas and mixing, so the names, so this is nothing I have invented, but this is what these actually is an import or transfer from Swoopfurt. So from an artist approach towards the border region, so playful discussion on earlier political hot topics, and the idea, let's say, if it's done in a playful manner, so it might lead to other ways of discussion. So, and one of these ideas was to allude to the Sedina debate, so with people then posing as new Sedina, and the flag is then this flag of the new region that was imagined of Nova America. So actually, these are my major points. Let's see whether I wanted to add something. No, I think we there's one more thing which could be introduced if we have these mnemonic discourses. So I was talking about the prosthetic memory, but there's also the idea of post-memory, which comes actually from debates or the history of Holocaust survivors by Marianne Hirsch. But so where, let's say, following generations, so not of the victims of the Holocaust, but let's say the grandchildren, then treat this experience of their grandparents as a part of their own memory. And one might discuss whether such an approach could also be, let's say, transposed to the society of Szczecin, meaning remembering the German past, not by own experience, but by, let's say, the appropriation or the identification with the former inhabitants. So this is definitely something which is going on. And if we have these, let's say, overall picture, then we see that we are far away from only talking about the territorial border between Germany and Poland and treating, let's say, 1945 as a hard temporal border, but we see quite a lot of boundaries which are definitely there, which are of course also linguistically have a linguistic background, but could no longer be, let's say, only interpreted as something as a German-Polish contradiction or a German-Polish dialogue. So it's definitely something else. And maybe with this, I'll stop here and would be happy for your comments on these ideas. Thank you very much.
Professor Hackmann, thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. Meanwhile, we have some excellent guests who have joined us. Meanwhile, we are not many, but we represent 3 different institutes of our university. So I think this is a great example how interdisciplinary approach is needed, and we can see it in this talk very clearly. If you would like to ask or comment on what we have heard, please do so. First, you shall raise your hand, and then I will activate your microphone so that you can speak freely. Maybe I would only very shortly comment on that there is a lot of things I would like to say. I will give, not, of course, some more space to others. Just one little comment straight after your talk would be that I liked very much that you presented the idea of Michael Cotrelli with Nova America. It is, I think, the first time when I could hear this aspect of artistic practice as being integrated into the scientific discourse. So I like this very much, because I have heard many times words of rejection of this project from the perspective of science. So I think this is very important and an important aspect of it. And by the way, this picture of Sedina was taken by me. It was my project. I don't know if you knew this, it was at the time before I became scientist. So it is an old project. Okay, so please comment and ask, but raise your hand first, please. Professor Kowalewski. Microphone is activated.
Yeah, it should work.
Yes. Yes.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Professor Hackmann, for your lecture. I have this impression that when we are referring to the German past of our city, there is a lot of admiration of the urban heritage, and it is like that people are admiring the way the city was planned and the architecture, and I think we know that this is idealized by these pictures of pre-war city when we didn't have any documentation on urban areas that were disadvantaged, where poor people were lived, where the crime level was high, and so on. So let's say that this is something like the idealized version of the pre-war Stettin. And would you find any other fields of admiration besides the architecture and the urban planning from these pre-war times? I mean, when nowadays, when inhabitants are thinking about this past, they say that before 1945, the city was designed in a better way, or it was better taught how to communicate different parts of the city. The city was well planned with beautiful architecture that has to be preserved and so on. But beside that, would you find any fields of admiration that people are referring to thinking about pre-war Stettin? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I understand that we that I'm answering right now, or would you like to collect the questions? Okay, so maybe the micro is off, but okay. So the first thing, so before I answer your question, yeah, thank you very much for the hint on the photograph. So actually, so I'll definitely give credits to Professor Wojcik now that the photograph is from you. And actually, I think I used it already for a couple of years, so I have to check where I took it primarily from the first time. Okay, but so the question of the admiration of the urban structure and other alternatives, I think so. Definitely so the approach to the visual culture, so and in public space is definitely, I would say, dominating, which might of course also be connected to the fact that let's say in cultural terms, Szczecin actually was not, or Stettin, so the German Stettin was not that advanced. So let's say it was a booming, economically booming city, but maybe not at the avant-garde of German cultural development. Although one might look into this a little bit more closely and then see that at least collections of art definitely existed, but they are partly, let's say, largely somehow dispersed and no longer there. So it means you need not of knowledge to, let's say, see what has been there before and how, let's say, the museum functioned in pre-war time. So this might be more difficult than, let's say, the admiration of the architecture which has been preserved. What is interesting is, so from my first visits, so this is more, let's say, personal observations, is that actually, maybe because this was when I was working as a tour guide for German groups, so there always was told that, so by the Polish guides, how they admire so the city, but then at the same moment not relating it to the Germans, but always explaining that these three rondos are a clear copy of Baron Haussmann from Paris. And let's say the follow-up of this is now that you have the belt of Orion, yeah. So it means it's not by the majority or the large public related to German or Prussian history, but something which, let's say, stems from a far past, and it's nice to see. But so meaning these forms of admiration actually as somehow limited or at least competed. So maybe it's general great European heritage, but it's not Prussian, so and so on. It's not connected to the Germans, and of course. Much easier would be to connect it, let's say, to see, to compare Stettin with Berlin, and then, of course, many interesting things would pop up. But I have not really seen this so far, apart from the architects, I would say. Okay, so maybe this is not the full answer. Yeah, but one more thing is that, of course, the linguistic barrier exists. So this means architecture you could perceive much easier, let's say, than German literature. So this is, then you need, so let's say, reading text from the 19th century makes things or limits the scope of people who are able to do this. Maybe let's leave it for the first moment with this answer.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Hackmann. We have a question from Dr. Balicki, who asked me to read this question for you. The question is pretty short. If we take city as text, then what will be saying Stettin about Germans and Szczecin about Poles?
All right, yeah. So I saw it also in the chat. Yeah. So of course, so how to read the city. So and one thing actually, so what I was doing was, let's say, interpreting the reconstruction of the old town. So what, let's say, was then started in the late 1950s as a clear Polish text, urban texture. So question whether it's only Polish, but it's at the same time, it's definitely also following norms of modern architecture of the 1950s, so that you should have of course, functional apartments, so that you have should have green, you should have light, and so on, and not be rebuilt. So these dark and not very comfortable buildings that have disappeared. So this means the interpretation of the Polish Szczecin definitely went through modernist discourse. So the Polish Szczecin was a modernist city. Whereas it's more difficult to say whether there is a coherent German text of Stettin. So apart from this, that everything that was until 1945 was nice, and afterwards it's gone. But it might. So if we just, let's say, do it in the urban texture and say, so okay, so what is pre-45 is definitely German, and what is post 45 must be Polish. So this worked, I would say, for a long time, but since the 1980s, this at least has been blurred. But if we would read, let's say, the pre-45 Stettin, it definitely, of course, we could say that all these official buildings that were erected somehow followed Prussian rules and reflected, let's say, understandings of history. Although definitely in Stettin we have this impact, this civic impact, which, let's say, makes it different from smaller Prussian provincial towns where we only have, let's say, the city hall building or the post building and the railway building following, let's say, Prussian patterns. So Stettin is definitely then also showing more individual features, meaning that obviously, so the local identity was not only based on Prussian identity, but has something to do, let's say, with the openness towards the sea and so on. And actually, this is there one might also see some kind of a connection or similar patterns than followed after 1945. Not connected, but rather as parallel ones. So did I answer the question as you wanted it? So maybe one might add, of course, we have this, let's say, also a very German interpretation of Stettin, but this is then a rather nostalgic one, and this is if we look at this strange book by Ilse Gooden, which I think was only in the early 2000s published. So it's collecting everything, so it's rather eclectic and not really reflecting on what has happened after 1945. So this is was beyond her horizon, and also of many of those coming from Stettin.
Thank you very much. Dr. Suchacka, you also had a question?
Yes, thank you very much. I will not be switching on my camera because I have some problems with the connection, so I worry that I will be switched off completely. Thank you, Professor Hackmann, for your wonderful presentation. I was wondering about Szczecin as a space of memory nowadays. How would you evaluate it? How would you evaluate Szczecin as a space of memory now? Would you say that the political, social, maybe even urban changes create a new type of memory? Or maybe it goes back again to both pasts or breaks with this past and creates something maybe new? Yes, so that would be my question.
Yeah, I would definitely say that something new has emerged or is emerging. The question is, so let's say whether we could define how it started and let's say what was earlier, so the hen or the egg. So meaning whether the idea of reconstructing Podzamcze started a whole debate, or whether this debate was not already informed that somehow the old historic structures should be preserved and transformed into, let's say, modern urban structures. So this is actually what I see. And interestingly, so let's say, as Leszek Hamann also has a background as an architect, so also, let's say, the literary working with these historic elements of Szczecin and Sedinum, first of all. So is somehow connected to, let's say, architectural monuments and relics of the city. So it seems that this is definitely what I would see is has a major impact. The other thing, so I was a little bit talking about these monuments, but you see that monuments are, of course, much more complicated, and rather than connected to the concrete past, let's say, apart from Corleone, let's say, relating to Renaissance Venice, but let's say if you do the Sedina, of course, it's difficult. Talk about Sedina, so it's difficult to let's say detach the monument or the shape of the monument from its German history. And actually, so with monuments, it's much easier, let's say, to make new national monuments, which we see emerge in town. There's maybe one more mnemonic structure, and this is I haven't been talking about this, but I could have mentioned it. So that's this meaning not reconstructing old houses, but using the space. So, and this is clearly what you see with the Philharmony. So you have a total modernist building, but on the place on the site where the former Philharmony has been. So meaning that this also adds to the bridging of the gap and including the pre-war structures into, let's say, everyday life.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Maybe I would follow on this path because you were just speaking about the monuments and also you spoke about them a bit during your talk, and I think it's a very interesting operation with Corleone and Sedina that took place in Szczecin, because on the one hand, it's one could say either the original in the case of Corleone, of course the copy of the Italian original, but the Szczecin original, or Sedina. There was a plan of establishing an exact copy of what was in Szczecin before 1945, but at the same time, it's not about conserving the past, as many buildings that are protected by UNESCO, but there is a new meaning to them, and I think it's not only remembering the time before socialism, but I think a very important element of it is that both monuments were coming from the past before the inhabitants of the city who live here today were here. So there was an attempt to establishing a kind of bridge to the past and feeling at home. With Corleone, we could see that after it was put on the place where it is today. It became actually more important than it was before, because before it was in a museum and now it is being exposed in public space. But there were also organized some important gatherings. There was once, I can remember 2005, I think, an all-party gathering of all politicians being represented in the Polish Sejm. And when they were acting for this region, they organized a press conference and a meeting at Corleone. So this was a symbol of people from here, which were not divided by political differences. With time, Corleone lost this role, and I think it's also interesting that it was very important for the people in the 1990s to get this monument back. But after it was put on a square, it took maybe 10 years, and actually it's now a monument like any other in the city. Everybody knows it's there, but the meaning of it actually disappeared. And with Sedina, it was very interesting also because the monument was not there. It was not to be brought to Szczecin, but it had to be produced once again. And I think there was there was this link to the past, but with a different approach, because in the German Stettin there was an idea you were talking about of this flourishing city in economical way, mainly at the end of the 19th century. But for the people of Polish Szczecin at the turn of the 21st century, I think it was important that there was this link to the past, and so not the monument was as important to them, but the idea behind it, to have a monument with which they really could identify. And it seems that there has not been a monument like this in the city before. Colony played this role for a short moment, but yeah, maybe for 10 years, the maximum, I would say. And Sedina had the chance to become such a monument, but also with time, this memory was weaker and weaker, maybe because people in the city after 1990, they looked for the link in the past, and now they orient themselves more to the future. I don't know, but maybe this is the reason. I also think when we look at what the city council, the local government, is doing, there is a very distinctive orientation towards future. There is very little of what we can see from the past. Catherine II, for example, was born in this city, but there is nearly no sign of it. There is only one little sign, but no museum, no events. Actually, nothing. We have the idea of the so-called floating garden 2050. So by the name, we can see that the factors important for the city are actually nature, floating as water, garden as green, and 2050, it's future. And the city birthday, there is an event like this being celebrated in the city now, and it's July the 5th. So you mentioned the town law of 1243, but the city birthday is the day when the Polish administration took over the city in 1945. So the city council says us, actually, the city was born 1945 and not 1243. Yeah, so it's more like a comment. Maybe I hope you could disagree on something so that we can discuss.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, of course. So this is, actually, so talking about the monuments, there we have this idea famous from Reinhard Koselleck, but not only him, so that the role of the monuments, let's say, in society is not in first place shaped by the monument itself, but rather by the social actions connected to the monuments. So let's say if no one goes there, so then maybe it doesn't play a role in the society. And of course, then we also should see that changes might happen, so that something which has been relevant 10 years ago is no longer relevant today. And of course, let's say in a society quickly changing, so such changes might happen more quickly than in rather settled societies, which would then explain the Corleone thing. And of course, I agree, so that a copy definitely is not under monuments protection, whereas the original copy definitely is. But nevertheless, so it's clearly that what happened to Corleone was not a, let's say, restitution to its former relevance, but using it for something different, different discourse. And of course, I would say Corleone is much more open, let's say, for new meanings than a monument which has a clear, let's say, a message that you cannot push away. So, and Sedina, I would say, is there rather with this clear message. This might might explain also the difference. But so as I saw, the Sedina debate was that at least in in our institute, there were some voices who clearly put it the old way and say, so this is a German monument, this has nothing to do with us. Why should we replace a Prussian monument which belongs to someone else? So this is definitely was something different. This was belonging to the others and not to us, which might also explain why this identification approach did not fully work. But on the other hand, you could also ask, so why does a society need a monument which expresses its own identity? So do you really need it? So let's say if I would imagine some other towns outside of Poland, so maybe 19th century there might have been such cases. But recent discourses, so let's say that people in Monachium put up a monument that identifies them as inhabitants of Monachium. I think I wouldn't see this, and I think for France you could do, in UK you could say similar things. So meaning if you need such an place of identification, so then it might mean that your identification is somehow not fixed. It's endangered, competed, or so on. And then, of course, you could say so that the Sedina project, for whatever reasons, it failed. So I think probably it was more the reasons in the city council. But nevertheless, so maybe there is no longer such a need for such an identification figure. But this might be rather something the sociologists should say, society is split up politically so that there is even no chance of agreeing for such a monument, but you are rather doing then monuments for the deceased president, or you do monuments for Dmowski or Pilsudski, whomsoever, and then people gather according to their political orientation around these monuments. So this might be useful looking into this, might be interesting thing. So I definitely could not do it within this article. But what I also had and didn't say today, but this was this debate when there was about the removal of communist memory. So it was not only putting the monument of gratitude away, but it was also the idea that so the remembrance of the Red Army conquering or coming into the cities should be removed, so with the street name. So there you clearly see that the debate about what is it, 28th of April or 5th of July at a given point was also political clash. So it somehow, I would say, also has disappeared, but definitely, let's say, looking from a historian's perspective, so explaining so the 5th of July as birthday as a historian is really difficult, because you have to say what happened before. So between the end of the war or the taking over of Szczecin by the Red Army and 5th of July. So it's definitely a problematic issue, or it might be used, at least, let's say, for such talks in showing the difficulties of building clear national memories. So if you do, let's say, some kind of a broader hybrid one, of course, then you could also explain that something has happened between end of April and summer of 45.
Thank you very much. We have another question or comment by Professor Bartłomiejski. Your micro is activated now, please.
Okay. Good morning. I'm sorry I was late. I haven't heard everything from the beginning, but the question relates to the new town hall. It's a new town hall, the red house in Szczecin center, where Hermann Hacken and Friedrich Hackmann held their office. And on the west side, above the entrance of that building, there are 4 ceramic figures symbolizing knowledge, agricultural industry, and maritime economy. And the colors of the floating garden nowadays in Szczecin, they the visual identity refers to the water, greenery, and the space. I wonder, and the city authorities today believe that the colors of the logo are an important factor for shaping the identity and the perception of the Szczecin brand. In your opinion, is it that symbolism is perceived in the same way by Stettinians and Szczecinians today? And is it the same way the residents of Szczecin and the German city of Stettin or maybe is it really important for the people of Szczecin today in shaping their identity as it was in 19th century with those 4 columns? Does it make sense to make such things?
Yeah, this might be a question to urban sociologists, so maybe I return the question to you. How does, let's say, identification with a local space work? So it's definitely, I would say, it's not only so in Germany, not at all. So by features of national culture. So maybe sometimes it comes in, but it's definitely not dominating. So in Poland, I would say it's, so let's say having reference to national symbols is probably more dominating. Sometimes, so it just works by the colors. So of course, as you see it, so it's now a very general answer. So the red, white, blue, yellow. So Ukraine or Sweden, or red, white. You have also with the Danes. So it's if you have such easy elements, so of course they could be easily used. So, and for, let's say, Germans, it's much more complicated, not only due to history, but let's say working with so German national colors in representing anything outside of the federal government would be definitely very difficult. Yeah. So. But so, do we have in the floating garden? Do we have red there? I think so. It's
no. I was talking that the system is about water, greenery, and space.
Yeah. So maybe there's something. So I would say that if we look just, let's say, at the colors. So definitely. So any previous German commemoration or identification would have somehow. Also worked with red, let's say, just dominated by the bricks and the color of the bricks, and which of course has also a Prussian symbolism, so relating to the architecture of the Teutonic Knights, so which then, let's say, from the 1820s, so after the Napoleonic Wars, were then integrated in Prussian state identity. So before Prussian government had nothing to do with the Teutonic Knights, so these were Catholic orders. So, and why should they identify with them? But after the defeat of Napoleon, so this started to work, so that the glorious past of the Teutonic Knights, which then was very much working with the, let's say, red and white colors from the medieval architecture, and then particularly, I would say, the red color then was somehow also used for the architecture. So with the red town hall, so this is definitely not by accident, and showing that all these brick buildings then are not plastered, so as post offices and so on. So then you clearly have it. Whether, let's say, these, one might look a little bit. I'm not such an expert, let's say, in the city discourses of the late 19th century, but my impression is that, let's say, these civic debates were more focusing on the own progress and not only on the great deeds of the Hohenzollern dynasty and the Prussian state. So this was definitely, let's say, something which related to the own potential, and of course from the beginning of the 20th century also towards nature. So it was not just about, let's say, everything within the city limits, but also looking what, let's say, how is the relation to nature, and you will also see it, let's say, with the Hakenterrasse, so opening to the river was not only, let's say, a symbol of German militarism. Of course, you could understand it partly this way, and maybe part of this is true, but it's not the whole story. And you could also, so if we just look for comparison, so Gdańsk is difficult and different because Gdańsk was always heavily relying on their own great past. So meaning all these new buildings were clearly relating to the own history. So new Renaissance buildings and so on. Whereas Kiel would be my other case. So in Kiel you have this case that they built a new town hall, and then they made a copy of the Tower of San Marco from Venice, and not by accident because it actually collapsed. So in Venice a couple of years before, so they made some kind of a transposed reconstruction of the Tower of San Marco, and of course also with the argument that this is Kiel is a city shaped by the sea, and all the progress wealth comes from the sea. And I would say that probably so the Red Town Hall is also connected to such kind of idea. So it's not only looking at the Prussian state history and tradition, but only on the own achievements.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. When I was listening to your talk, I remembered one of a lecture we had within this lecture series almost a year ago by Professor Martina Löw, a sociologist from Berlin, and she has been leading a big project for several years now of refiguration of spaces, and she was talking about 4 different understandings of space nowadays, and I thought this description shows very much how complicated the case of Szczecin, or Stectin is, because actually all different kinds of spaces that Professor Löw mentioned could be used at least partially on this city. As she mentioned, a so-called territorial space with a logic of bordering, for example, a playground in the city, or the way the city of Russia is defined today. And for example, the pandemic showed that the territories can be closed again, and this border between Germany and Poland was nearly impermeable. So I think this was quite a good example how difficult it is to create the region of Pomerania, a transnational region. Another category she used was place. It was a logic of multiple overlapping references, so that people, for example, at home have things from many different places of the world they have been, and this place where they live creates their identity. And I think the city of Szczecin has a lot of Prussian German past, like Cologne, the discussion of Sedina, the Facebook group, what is its name? Szczecin Znany i Historyczny, with nearly 50,000 members. Professor Löw used also the category of place, of network space with a logic of association, a space created by Twitter, for example, with users in many different places in the world, by creating one network space. And when we think, for example, about books being written by people whose ancestors used to live in the German Pomerania, we have such books written in the 21st century of people who don't live not in the German, not in the Polish Pomerania, but their ancestors used to live here. It could be also an example of network space. And the last category she used was trajectorial space, with the logic of traversing, of moving. For example, the Chinese project of the Silk Road, or the transit roads in the big cities. And when we think about tourists, mainly German tourists, going to Mazur and to Missouri, that cross Pomerania but not really discover it, it could be also an example for it. It was just an association. How complicated this case actually is, maybe just as last words, because we also were speaking before our meeting that Professor Hackmann has also other obligations, and we should finish today as exact on time as possible. So maybe as some short comment on our meeting today. Thank you very much, Professor Hackmann, for being with us, for sharing your knowledge.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here. So, and maybe one last sentence after the ending. So, thank you for the hint to Martina Löw. It's of course a very interesting thing. And so, and as you have seen, I let's say rather have done a rather usual historian's approach. So, not coming with a or developing a theory or let's say perceptions of space. But one thing I have not been talking about, but which is definitely very relevant if we speak about the changes or what facilitated, let's say, Polish Szczecin, is that, let's say, the most important borders in the city have changed. So let's say for most cases, if you look at medieval towns, so the size of the plots, so on the ground where you build houses, so is a fixed one. And for instance, in Lübeck, so you still have the borders between houses from the 13th century, which define what you're doing today. So with the huge turn of 1945, all these this really relevant and hard borders have disappeared, and giving then place for something new. And this is actually, so one more thing. So we see definitely lots of connections between Stettin and Szczecin in practical ways and how approaching the city. And one thing I was arguing already from the beginning is that there's a clear connection between the plans of the last German city planner Bernhard Reichow and what Piotr Zaremba did. And the only difference was that Reichow did not think about Poles yet to take over, and Zaremba then had to need to somehow label this concept as a Polish one. But the ideas were quite similar, and Reichow had the problem that he could not realize it, not only due to the outcome of the war, but also because he then would have had to expropriate lots of house and ground owners in Szczecin, which definitely wouldn't have been possible. So there are lots of these things. One might look more closely into it, let's say, make this connection between German and Polish city. So maybe but happy to continue this, and I think there will be occasions. So thank you very much for bringing me on your screen and for listening to me. So, and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you very much. Maybe some last comment from Dr. Balicki on our chat. It was very interesting. I realized how deep the change was of 1945. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.